The pounding started before sunrise, sharp, frantic, desperate. It rattled the glass panes of my lakefront door and sent the wind chimes into a nervous tremble. By the time I reached the foyer, I could already hear sirens echoing across Hartwell Lake. Not police. Rescue. When I opened the door, Douglas Renshaw stood on my porch soaked in lake mist, his face red with fury. Behind him, Lorraine Pike clutched her coat tight against the cold, shouting over the wind. "You flooded it," she screamed. "You sabotaged the road." Across the northern shelf of my lake, their brand-new asphalt private access road was vanishing under rising water. 2 luxury SUVs sat stranded mid-span, hazard lights blinking uselessly as the lake swallowed the painted center line inch by inch. "I didn't sabotage anything," I said, steady even as my pulse thudded in my ears. "I followed the maintenance schedule my father wrote 40 years ago." Douglas stepped closer. "I can have you arrested for this. You'll pay for every dollar of damage." "You weaponized the water," Lorraine snapped. A deputy's cruiser rolled into my driveway just as another wave slid over the asphalt. They built their road on my flood shelf. And today was February 15th, and as the water crept another inch over the asphalt, I realized they still had no idea what they had actually built on. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I inherited Hartwell Lake the way some people inherit jewelry or old letters, with weight, memory, and responsibility stitched into every acre. My father built Hartwell Dam before I was born. He poured concrete with his own hands, calibrated spillway tolerances with slide rules, and wrote the seasonal maintenance schedule in a weatherproof ledger that still sits in my study. He used to say, "Water doesn't care about pride, Abby. It only cares about gravity." I grew up watching him open the gates every February 15th for ice management and spring staging. The northern shelf would disappear under clean, rising water like clockwork, just as it had for decades. That shelf was never solid ground. It was a seasonal floodplain, soft in thaw, spongy after heavy snow, marked by high water lines older than most of the houses now surrounding it. In summer, it looked like meadow. In winter, it looked like opportunity to someone who didn't understand it. Summit Bluffs appeared 5 years ago, carved into the western ridge above my property. At first, I welcomed it. Families moved in. Porch lights flickered on at dusk. Kayaks dotted the water in July. Douglas Renshaw introduced himself during one of their early open house events. He arrived with polished shoes and a handshake that lingered half a second too long. "I'm a community builder," he told me, smiling as if he'd just offered a gift. "We're bringing life back to this area." I remember nodding politely, telling him the lake had been alive long before either of us. The HOA's first mention of the northern shelf came casually. Lorraine Pike sent a letter describing it as an unused buffer zone that would improve access between 2 sections of their development. They framed it as an enhancement, safer entry points for emergency vehicles, better traffic flow, aesthetic cohesion. The language was confident, almost rehearsed. Unused buffer zone. I walked the shelf that afternoon and felt the soil give beneath my boots. Unused was not the word I would have chosen. The first real warning sign was survey tape. Thin orange flags staked along the edge of my property line, fluttering in the wind without any notice sent to me. I pulled a few out myself and assumed it was a mistake. A week later, drainage testing equipment appeared, metal rods driven into the ground, small pumps humming briefly in the mornings. I told myself the county must have approved a study related to runoff mitigation. Then the construction trucks started arriving. Heavy, diesel-throated machines rumbling across ground that had submerged every winter since my childhood. They laid gravel first, compacted it aggressively, and I felt a strange disbelief as I watched from my porch. Surely someone had reviewed the floodplain maps. Surely someone understood that February would erase whatever they built. I made a call to the county planning office. No active permit applications matched that location. I assumed clerical delay. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, until asphalt appeared. Black, glossy, fresh. A painted white center line gleaming in late summer sun. Guardrails bolted along a stretch that had been underwater 6 months earlier. A bold sign planted at the entrance. Private access road. Residents only. I drove home in silence that evening and opened my property records. I overlaid GIS boundary maps against the satellite imagery. Zoomed in. Measured twice. The road did not brush against my property line. It sat squarely inside it. No recorded easement. No right-of-way agreement. No variance, just pavement laid across land my father had protected for 40 years. Within a month, Summit Bluffs residents received invoices for a new lake access maintenance fee. It was presented as necessary upkeep for their road. Snow clearing, structural inspection, safety compliance. I heard about it from one of the younger homeowners who sheepishly asked if I planned to contribute. Contribute. To infrastructure on my flood shelf. The unease that had been simmering quietly began to sharpen. It wasn't just trespass. It was presumption. They had built permanence on something that was never meant to stay dry, and they were charging people for the privilege of driving across it. I replayed every conversation I'd had with Douglas in my head, his smooth assurances, his careful phrasing, the way he referred to the shelf as if it were already theirs, as if repetition alone could redraw boundaries. I printed the overlays. I highlighted the deed lines. I opened my father's maintenance ledger and flipped to February 15th. The lake had followed the same rhythm for decades: ice management, gradual release, controlled rise. Predictable. Documented. Boring even. Unless someone forgot what the land actually was. The day I requested their permit documentation was the day Douglas stopped smiling. The first time I walked into a Summit Bluffs HOA meeting, I told myself I was going there to clarify a misunderstanding. The clubhouse smelled faintly of new carpet and burnt coffee. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table where Douglas Renshaw sat at the center, Lorraine Pike to his right, Caleb Sutton flipping through a binder on his left. A printed agenda was projected onto a white screen: budget review, landscaping adjustments, lake access updates. Lake access. I waited until public comment opened. My palms were steady, but I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward me as I stood. "My name is Abigail Hartwell," I began, though most of them knew that already. "The private access road recently constructed along the northern shelf of Hartwell Lake is entirely within my deeded boundary. There is no recorded easement. I am requesting documentation of your permits and land use authorization." The room fell quiet. Douglas leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if I had just asked a trivial question about trash pickup. He gave me a slow, indulgent smile. "Ms. Pride." "Hartwell," he said into the microphone, his voice amplified and smooth, "we've conducted extensive surveys. The land in question was identified as unused buffer space adjacent to our development. I believe there may be some confusion regarding historic property lines." Confusion. A few residents shifted in their seats. No one spoke. "There's no confusion," I replied. "I've overlaid GIS data with recorded deeds. The road sits entirely inside my boundary." Douglas's smile thinned. "With respect, you're not a surveyor, and the community has already invested significant resources into that infrastructure. It benefits everyone." "It floods every February," I said plainly. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the back row, quickly stifled. Lorraine adjusted her glasses and leaned toward her microphone. "The lake's levels have been stable for years. They've been managed," I corrected. "By me." Douglas's expression changed. Not anger yet, but irritation. "Are you suggesting you control the water?" "I operate the dam under established maintenance protocols." A murmur spread now, sharper. Some of the newer homeowners looked surprised. Douglas cleared his throat. "The road is compliant, and unless you can provide certified evidence otherwise, we consider this matter closed." The meeting moved on without further discussion. I sat down slowly, feeling something hot and unfamiliar press against my ribs. It wasn't fear. It was humiliation. They had applauded Douglas when the meeting adjourned. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at my mailbox. Cease interference notice. It accused me of harassing the association and attempting to disrupt community infrastructure. It warned that further interference could result in legal action for damages and defamation. I read it twice, then placed it on my kitchen table beside my father's maintenance ledger. The following week, I received another letter, this one labeled Notice of Violation. According to Summit Bluffs, my dam operations posed an active risk to community infrastructure, and I was required to submit a water management mitigation plan for HOA approval. HOA approval. I laughed once, sharply, alone in my kitchen. Then Caleb Sutton showed up. He arrived in a white SUV marked with the HOA logo and stepped out carrying a clipboard. I watched from my porch as he crossed the grass toward the shoreline. Mr. C. Sutton, I called. He did not stop. I'm conducting a shoreline safety inspection, he announced, not looking at me. We've received reports that fluctuating water levels may compromise the road base. You are trespassing, I said. He crouched near the waterline, tapping the soil with a metal rod. This is for community safety. I took photographs. Close-ups of his shoes crossing my boundary markers. Wide shots of his vehicle parked on my land. Time-stamped images of him driving stakes into saturated earth. He finally looked up, irritation flashing across his face. You're making this adversarial. You made it adversarial when you poured asphalt on my flood shelf. Within days, the HOA's tone escalated. Emails circulated among residents suggesting I was unstable, that I was threatening the community's property values, that my erratic dam behavior might require regulatory oversight. Neighbors who once waved from their decks now avoided eye contact. The silence stung more than Douglas's words. Then a final letter arrived, this one from an attorney representing Summit Bluffs. It warned that any intentional flooding of community infrastructure would result in immediate civil litigation for damages. I drove to the clubhouse again. This time, Douglas met me outside. You're overreacting, he said calmly. The road is permanent. It is not permanent, I replied. You will not sabotage this community out of spite. I have never sabotaged anything. His jaw tightened. If you flood that road, we will sue you into the ground. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. I operate the dam according to schedule, I said. As I have for decades. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You won't dare. I held his gaze. Then he said something that changed everything. You won't dare open those gates. The pressure campaign started quietly, then all at once. 3 days after Douglas told me I would not dare open the gates, I received a formal letter from Summit Bluffs' attorney. It accused me of intentional interference with community infrastructure and warned that any operational manipulation of lake levels resulting in damage to the private access road would trigger immediate litigation. The number printed at the bottom, projected damages, was exaggerated enough to be theatrical. The next morning, my inbox filled with forwarded emails from residents I barely knew. Community update, ongoing threat to lake access. Douglas had written it himself. He described me as a private landholder acting outside cooperative norms. He implied I was threatening emergency vehicle access. He referred to the dam as a personal lever of control. Lorraine added a financial angle, reminding homeowners of their investment in the road and hinting that legal costs might be shared among residents if external interference continued. External interference. On land that had belonged to my family longer than most of those houses had existed. Then came the environmental complaint. I learned about it when the county left a voicemail requesting clarification regarding a report of unregulated spillway discharge. The complaint alleged that I had altered water flow without notification, potentially impacting downstream wetlands. It was fiction. I drove to the county office with a folder under my arm, thick enough to qualify as a small archive. I had decades of compliance documentation, seasonal maintenance logs in my father's handwriting, certified inspection reports, water level records, structural assessments, environmental impact statements. Everything dated, everything signed. The deputy who arrived at my property 2 days later was polite but cautious. Officer Ryan Delgado stood on my porch holding a clipboard, reading from a report that described fluctuating water levels as a public hazard. Ma'am, he said gently, we just need to verify there isn't a safety issue. There isn't, I replied. There never has been. I led him to my study and laid the records across my dining table. Page after page of maintenance consistency. February 15th, every year. Controlled increase. Measured release. Logged communication with water management offices. He flipped through them slowly, his expression shifting from suspicion to quiet respect. "This is thorough," he admitted. "It's routine," I said. He left without issuing any warning. But the trucks kept coming. Every afternoon I watched from my porch as SUVs and construction vehicles crossed the asphalt ribbon cutting through my flood shelf. Children rode bicycles across soil that would be submerged within weeks. The white center line gleamed like a scar across the land. I stopped sleeping well. I would wake at 3 in the morning and walk to the window, half expecting to see new signage erected overnight. I found myself counting headlights, tracking traffic patterns, documenting timestamps. They were building their narrative carefully. If something happened to that road, it would be because of me. One evening, Harold Finch from the county building department called me back. "I reviewed the construction permits," he said. "There aren't any." "None?" I asked. "No grading permit. No culvert installation approval. No right-of-way filing. And no easement," I added. "Correct." His tone carried something heavier than procedural neutrality now. "That road shouldn't be there." The confirmation felt less like relief and more like validation of what I already knew. They had not misunderstood. They had bypassed. I printed Harold's email and placed it in a growing folder labeled Summit Bluffs. That same week, another community-wide message circulated accusing me of threatening neighborhood safety. Douglas suggested forming a legal defense fund. Lorraine posted carefully worded updates implying regulatory intervention might be necessary if certain landowners refused cooperation. They were isolating me. Neighbors who once waved from kayaks now avoided docking near my shoreline. Conversations ended abruptly when I walked into the general store. A rumor circulated that I planned to drain the lake entirely. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so effective. I realized I could not navigate this alone. Victor Leland had represented my family in property matters for years. He was not dramatic, not loud, not prone to outrage. He believed in documentation and patience, two things I understood well. When I called him, I kept my voice level. "They build infrastructure inside my boundary," I said. "They're collecting fees. They're threatening litigation if I operate normally." There was a pause on the line. "Send me everything," Victor replied. I did. Deeds, overlays, photos, Harold's confirmation, the cease interference notice, the environmental complaint. Victor called back the next day. "They have no easement," he said. "No permits. And if they're collecting fees under false pretenses, that's another layer entirely." "So what do we do?" I asked. "For now," he said carefully, "you continue following your established maintenance schedule. Exactly as written." The following Monday, Summit Bluffs issued an official announcement. Emergency HOA meeting, vote to pursue civil damages against external party. The date printed at the bottom was not accidental. February 15th. Douglas announced emergency HOA vote to pursue damages against me, scheduled for February 15th. For weeks, I let them believe I was simply a stubborn landowner clinging to old boundaries. I never corrected them. What Douglas never bothered to learn, what none of them asked, was that before I inherited Hartwell Dam, before I became its steward, I built a career around water. I am a licensed hydrological compliance engineer. 15 years ago, I sat on a regional advisory panel that helped draft updated flood control standards for 3 counties, including this one. I understand not only how water moves, but how jurisdiction follows it. Floodplains are not decorative. They are regulated. The northern shelf of Hartwell Lake is classified as seasonal floodplain with downstream connectivity to a federally monitored watershed. Any permanent structure placed within that zone without permit review falls under layers of county and, potentially, federal oversight. Douglas had assumed asphalt made land permanent. He had confused pavement with ownership. The week before February 15th, I stopped reacting emotionally. I stopped replaying the humiliation at the HOA meeting. I stopped reading their emails twice. Instead, I pulled out my father's ledger and turned to the page that had been written in careful block letters decades ago. February 15th, ice management release. Gradual gate increase. Notify county. Monitor downstream velocity. Routine. Boring. Predictable. The power of routine is that it does not look like retaliation. I called Marlene Ortiz at the County Water Management Office on a Tuesday morning. Marlene, this is Abigail Hartwell. I'm logging seasonal maintenance notice for Hartwell Dam. There was a shuffle of papers on her end. Same schedule as prior years. Yes, controlled increase beginning February 15th. Gradual rise over 5 days. Understood, she said. I'll document the notice. That was it. No drama, no raised voices. Just paperwork. I sent a follow-up email summarizing the call, attaching last year's compliance inspection and projected water level charts. Time-stamped. Archived. Then I sat on my porch and watched another line of Summit Bluffs residents drive across the shelf as if it had always belonged to them. For the first time since the road appeared, I felt calm. I was not going to retaliate. I was not going to threaten. I was not going to open the gates out of spite. I was going to operate normally. There is something powerful about doing exactly what you have always done when someone is daring you not to. Victor called that evening to confirm receipt of my documentation. You're certain about the schedule? He asked. It's the same schedule we've followed for 40 years. And you've logged notice? Yes. He paused. Then you are not initiating anything. You are continuing established operations. Exactly. The following days were quiet in a way that felt artificial. Douglas did not contact me. The HOA emails shifted tone, reminders about the emergency vote, warnings about infrastructure protection, carefully worded suggestions that residents should attend to defend their investment. I reread one message twice. Douglas wrote, "We expect responsible parties to exercise restraint in light of community safety." Restraint. As if the dam had ever been anything but restrained. On February 14th, I walked down to the spillway before sunset. Ice still edged the shoreline, thin and brittle. The northern shelf lay exposed beneath a pale winter sky, the asphalt dark against dormant grass. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the stillness. My father used to say the dam was less about control and more about respect. Respect for timing. Respect for physics. Respect for the fact that nature always keeps its own calendar. At precisely 8 in the morning on February 15th, I unlocked the control housing and began the release. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Measured. Incremental gate lift according to schedule. I logged the time in ink, the way my father had taught me. Water does not surge when managed properly. It rises. Over the next 24 hours, the lake level climbed slowly. An inch. Then 2. Ice fragments shifted and cracked softly. By evening, the lowest edge of the northern shelf glistened. I did nothing unusual. I did not contact Douglas. I did not attend the emergency HOA vote. I did not stand at the shoreline and announce anything. I simply watched. From my porch, I could see vehicles still using the road. Residents assumed permanence because they had been told permanence existed. They trusted asphalt more than hydrology. That trust was not my responsibility. The second morning, water reached the outer guardrail posts. The asphalt darkened where saturation began beneath it. I photographed the rise at consistent intervals, documenting the same way I had documented compliance for years. There is a difference between aggression and inevitability. By the third day, I knew the turning point had arrived. Not in shouting, not in lawsuits, not in threats, but in physics. Douglas had built infrastructure inside a regulated floodplain without permits, easement, or hydrological assessment. He had collected fees based on the assumption that land remained dry simply because he wished it to. He had dared me not to open the gates. I never needed to dare back. They thought they built a road. What they really built was evidence. The first thing I did after logging the seasonal notice was install cameras. Not hidden in bushes, not concealed like some paranoid trap. Mounted openly along my fence line and angled toward the northern shelf. Time-stamped, cloud-backed, wide frame. I wanted clarity, not drama. If anyone questioned what happened next, I wanted the answers stored in pixels and physics. Every morning I reviewed the footage. Vehicles crossing the shelf. Children walking dogs. Caleb Sutton inspecting guardrails as if posture alone could reinforce engineering. And always the sign at the entrance, private access road, residents only. Residents were still paying for it. A neighbor I barely knew, Elliot Crane, knocked on my door one afternoon holding a copy of the HOA budget summary. He was quiet, careful with his words. They increased the lake access maintenance fee again, he said. We've paid more in 6 months than projected. Have they shown you invoices? I asked. He shook his head. Just summaries. Within a week, several homeowners had pooled funds to hire an independent forensic accountant. Her name was Naomi Brooks. She called me directly, not because I was involved financially, but because my boundary dispute had made her curious. I'm reviewing the road construction line items, she told me. Something feels circular. Circular. She requested access to public filings tied to Summit Bluffs' development entity. I sent her what I had. Nothing confidential, only what had been publicly registered. 3 days later, she called back with a tone that had shifted from curiosity to focus. Douglas Renshaw's development company subcontracted road construction to a secondary LLC, she said. That LLC lists him as majority stakeholder. So he hired himself, I replied. Yes. And billed the HOA at full commercial rate. Was the rate fair? Not remotely. The markup exceeds regional averages by more than 30%. The word 30% hung in the air like an accusation. Naomi continued digging. Culvert materials listed twice. Drainage reinforcement invoiced, but not installed to code. Engineering review charges with no engineer of record attached. While she followed money trails, I followed water. February 15th arrived without ceremony. The HOA emergency vote proceeded at the clubhouse that evening, but I did not attend. I had no interest in arguing hypotheticals. At 8 in the morning, I unlocked the gate housing and began the scheduled release. Everything was routine. Log. Recorded. Mirrored in the county's notification system. Marlene Ortiz confirmed receipt of my compliance email. The cameras captured the first inch of movement by late afternoon, a subtle shift where dormant grass met reflective surface. No drama, no rush. By the second day, the rise was visible to anyone paying attention. The outer edges of the asphalt darkened. Moisture crept upward through compacted gravel beneath the road base. Hydrology does not attack from above, first, it destabilizes from below. Yet Summit Bluffs continued business as usual. Another invoice was sent to residents titled Seasonal Infrastructure Stabilization Assessment. The irony was almost unbearable. Naomi called again on the third morning. It's worse than I thought, she said. The road wasn't just overpriced. The HOA reserve fund was partially diverted to cover construction overages. They're using maintenance fees to patch internal shortfalls. Are homeowners aware? I asked. Not fully. The reporting is opaque by design. By then, Elliot had begun quietly sharing Naomi's preliminary findings with a small group of concerned residents. A faction was forming, not loudly, not publicly, but with growing unease. Meanwhile, Douglas appeared confident. He sent a final community message reassuring homeowners that lake fluctuations are seasonal and fully accounted for in road engineering specifications. He described the structure as resilient. Resilient. I reviewed the camera footage at dusk that evening. The asphalt surface reflected the sky in faint, shimmering streaks. Water pressed against the underside of compacted soil. The culvert placement, installed without hydrological assessment, forced pressure into areas not designed to bear it. On the fourth day, tire tracks left damp impressions. Residents began slowing as they drove across. Some parked briefly, staring at the creeping waterline as if proximity alone could push it back. I said nothing. There is a peculiar calm that arrives when you realize you are no longer reacting to someone else's aggression, but allowing them to confront the consequences of their own decisions. By mid-afternoon, the first outer guardrail post was partially submerged. The cameras captured it clearly, time-stamped proof that this was not sudden, not malicious, not engineered sabotage. It was schedule. Naomi sent a final update before sunset. "I have enough to present to the homeowners," she said. "If the water compromises that road, this becomes more than a boundary issue." "It already is," I replied. As darkness settled over Hartwell Lake, headlights reflected off a surface that was no longer entirely dry. The white center line blurred beneath shallow ripples. By nightfall, the asphalt was already sweating beneath the current. The first SUV stalled just after noon. I watched it happen from my porch through the long lens of one of my cameras. The driver hesitated midway across the northern shelf as water pooled over the low point of the asphalt. He tried to accelerate. The engine revved once, twice, then died with a shudder. Hazard lights began blinking in shallow water that reflected the pale winter sky. A second vehicle attempted to reverse, but misjudged the saturated shoulder and slid sideways, one tire sinking into mud that had not seen sunlight in years. Within minutes, phones were out. Voices carried across the water. By the time the third car stopped at the entrance and refused to proceed, someone had called the sheriff's department. 2 patrol units arrived with lights flashing, sirens muted but urgent. Officer Ryan Delgado stepped out first, boots splashing through water that now covered nearly half the road's width. Douglas Renshaw arrived seconds later, breathless, coat unbuttoned, face flushed with anger. "This is deliberate," he shouted, pointing at me across the shoreline. "She flooded the road. She did this intentionally." I did not raise my voice when I walked down toward the edge of the shelf. The water was already touching the second guardrail post. "I followed my established maintenance schedule," I said calmly. Douglas gestured wildly at the stranded vehicles. "You weaponized the dam." Officer Delgado turned to me. "Ma'am, we need to understand what's happening." I handed him a folder I had prepared days earlier. Deed boundaries, GIS overlays, floodplain designation maps. My father's maintenance ledger, open to February 15th entries spanning decades. Printed confirmation of seasonal notice logged with the county. "This is routine operation," I said. "The northern shelf is seasonal floodplain." "It submerges every winter." Douglas laughed sharply. "That's not how it's been." "It is exactly how it's been," I replied. Harold Finch from the county building department arrived shortly after, summoned by one of the concerned homeowners. He stepped carefully onto the wet asphalt and examined the submerged culvert ends. "Mr. Renshaw," Harold said flatly, "I've already confirmed there are no active permits for this construction." Douglas stiffened. "We were finalizing paperwork." "For a road built inside a designated floodplain?" Harold asked. No answer came. Behind them, residents gathered in uneasy clusters. Some looked angry. Others looked confused. Elliot Crane stood near the entrance speaking quietly with a small group. Naomi Brooks arrived with a folder tucked beneath her arm, her expression controlled but resolute. "This might not be the right moment," she began softly to Elliot, but the word moment carried. "What now?" Douglas snapped when he saw her. Naomi didn't raise her voice. "I've completed a preliminary review of the road construction finances." "This isn't relevant," Douglas said sharply. "It is," she replied. "Your development company subcontracted the road project to an entity you control. The markup exceeds industry standards. Reserve funds were redirected without transparent disclosure." A murmur rippled through the gathered homeowners. "That's absurd," Lorraine interjected. "Those are internal accounting matters. They become relevant," Naomi continued evenly, "when residents are being charged ongoing maintenance fees for infrastructure that lacks proper permits and may not have been constructed to code." The tension shifted then, not away from me, but away from the narrative Douglas had carefully built. Still, he tried to regain control. "This is chaos because of her," he said, pointing at me again. "Her dam operations endanger property values and community safety." We need immediate action. Within the hour, an emergency HOA meeting was called at the clubhouse. Residents filed in, still damp from the shoreline confrontation. The room felt smaller than it had weeks earlier. Douglas took his place at the front table, posture rigid but voice steady. "This is a hostile act by an external landholder," he declared. "We must vote to pursue damages and explore eviction mechanisms for conduct endangering community infrastructure." Eviction. I almost admired the audacity. He framed it as protection, as defense, as safeguarding shared investment. I stood quietly near the back, listening. When he invited public comment, Elliot spoke first. Then another homeowner asked about the missing permits. Then someone mentioned the reserve fund discrepancy Naomi had uncovered. Douglas attempted to redirect. "This meeting is about immediate safety threats." "You mean the floodplain?" someone called out. He ignored it. Then he pivoted. "I motion that we initiate proceedings against Abigail Hartwell for reckless operational behavior and pursue community-backed civil damages." Lorraine seconded it immediately. Hands began to rise hesitantly. The room felt suspended between anger and doubt. Douglas lifted his own hand to call the vote. As he raised his hand to call the vote, I stood up with the document he never expected anyone to see. The room went still when I walked to the front. I didn't rush. I didn't argue. I placed a thin, certified envelope on the table directly in front of Douglas. "You forgot this," I said quietly. He didn't touch it. "It's from the county planning office," I continued. "Dated 8 months ago. It's your permit denial." A ripple moved through the room. Harold Finch stepped forward from the side wall. "That's accurate," he said evenly. Summit Bluff submitted an initial inquiry regarding roadway construction within the northern flood shelf. It was denied pending hydrological review and proof of land ownership. I slid a second document beside the first, stamped, signed, undeniable. "You were told this was designated seasonal floodplain," I said. "You were told no construction could proceed without engineering approval and an easement agreement." Douglas's jaw tightened. "That was preliminary." "It was final," Harold corrected. Douglas reached for the envelope, but I was already laying out the next stack. "These are your invoices," I said. Naomi stepped forward beside me and opened her folder. "We traced the construction payments," she explained, her voice steady. "Summit Bluffs contracted the road project to Renshaw Development Group." Several homeowners looked confused. Naomi continued. "Renshaw Development Group then subcontracted materials and grading through a secondary LLC, also majority-owned by Mr. Renshaw." A murmur turned into sharp whispers. "The markup exceeds standard regional construction margins by more than 30%, Naomi said. "And reserve funds were diverted to cover overruns. Those diversions were not disclosed in community reporting." Lorraine tried to interject. "That's internal accounting. It becomes external when residents are paying ongoing maintenance fees for infrastructure built without permits," Naomi replied. Elliot Crane stood slowly. "Is that true?" he asked Douglas directly. Douglas's composure cracked for the first time. "This is a smear," he said. "She's manipulating the situation." Officer Delgado stepped forward then, clearing his throat gently but firmly. "Mr. Renshaw," he said, "I need to address the trespass complaint." The word complaint hung heavy. Officer Delgado held up a folder of printed photographs, the images I had taken of Caleb Sutton conducting shoreline inspections beyond my boundary markers. "These show representatives of Summit Bluffs entering private property without authorization," the deputy said. "That's a violation." Douglas's face flushed. "And regarding the roadway," Harold added, "effective immediately, I am issuing a formal stop-use order pending structural and environmental review." Gasps scattered through the room. "Stop use?" Lorraine repeated weakly. "Vehicles are not to access the road until compliance is verified," Harold said. I spoke again, but softly. "Because it's inside a regulated floodplain," I reminded them. Naomi didn't stop. "There's more." She lifted another sheet. "We forwarded preliminary findings to the State Oversight Division regarding possible financial misconduct and misrepresentation of funds." Douglas's head snapped toward her. "You had no authority." As a certified forensic accountant hired by members of this association, she said calmly, I absolutely did. The weight in the room shifted completely then. It was no longer about a flood. It was no longer about a stubborn landowner. It was about deception. Elliot raised his hand, but not to vote against me. I motioned to remove Douglas Renshaw as acting president pending investigation. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one hand lifted. Then another. Then nearly the entire room. Douglas looked around in disbelief, watching the majority turn away from him. This is ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked force now. Officer Delgado stepped closer. Sir, I also need to inform you that the county has requested a formal review from environmental authorities due to potential unauthorized construction within a protected floodplain. That inquiry will likely expand. Federal jurisdiction. Douglas stared at me then, not angry anymore, but stunned. You did this, he whispered. No, I replied. You did. Outside, emergency lights still flickered against the waterlogged shelf. The stranded SUVs had been towed. The asphalt lay half submerged, reflecting red and blue and fractured lines. Lorraine sank back into her chair. Naomi closed her folder. Harold finished signing the stop-use notice. Elliot began speaking quietly with residents about interim board leadership. Douglas stood alone at the front of the room, stripped of authority in less than 20 minutes. Humiliation is loud when it first begins. Then, it becomes very quiet. By the time Officer Delgado escorted him outside for further questioning regarding trespass and financial discrepancies, no one applauded. No one cheered. They simply watched. As the patrol car lights reflected off the flooded asphalt, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Silence. Douglas Renshaw did not return to the clubhouse as president. Within a week, the board formally removed him pending investigation. Within a month, criminal fraud charges were filed tied to misappropriated HOA funds, self-dealing contracts, and false financial disclosures. The development entity he once presented as a badge of success became a liability under review. The road did not survive the season. After the stop-use order, structural engineers assessed what the water had already proven. The base had destabilized. Culverts had been installed improperly. The floodplain designation made retroactive compliance nearly impossible. The county issued a removal directive. Heavy equipment arrived again, this time not to pave, but to dismantle. Asphalt was cut into sections and hauled away. Guardrails unbolted. Gravel scraped back until the northern shelf breathed again. It looked scarred at first, raw and uneven, but honest. Dr. Connor Hale oversaw the restoration. He walked the shelf with soil samples in one hand and native seed plans in the other. Floodplains are resilient, he told me. They just need space. We gave it space. By early spring, grasses began to return. Sediment settled into familiar contours. The water rose and receded on schedule, uninterrupted by misplaced ambition. Summit Bluffs reorganized under Elliot Crane. Meetings grew quieter, less theatrical. Financial transparency became policy, not suggestion. Naomi's audit forced a refund program. Residents received back a portion of the lake access maintenance fees they had paid for a road that was never lawful to begin with. Some neighbors apologized. Some didn't. That part mattered less than the shift itself. I did not join the board. I did not attend every meeting. I returned to the role I had always held. Steward of Hartwell Lake, operator of a dam that answered only to physics and compliance, not ego. February came again the following year. On the 15th, I unlocked the control housing at 8 in the morning, just as my father had taught me. The ledger pages were no longer in his handwriting, but the rhythm remained. Measured. Documented. Routine. The northern shelf flooded clean, unobstructed. No asphalt shimmered beneath the surface. No stranded headlights blinked in defiance of gravity. Just water following the path it had always known. I stood on the porch at dusk that evening, listening to wind move across open surface, and felt the kind of quiet that doesn't need witnesses. Water remembers its path, and so does the truth. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?